I want to welcome all our viewers in the United States and around the world. I'm James Pierre. Tonight, we'll talk about the conflict between Israel and Iran. Rockets are flying. The United States now bombing 2 or 3 different nuclear sites. Why? Plus, we'll talk about the war between Russia and Ukraine. And to do so, joining us now is Professor Richard Tapia, political science at Miami College from Miami. Professor Tapia, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me on your program. It's a pleasure to be here.
The big question is why there is now a conflict between Israel and Iran.
Well, the root causes of the conflict are multiple, but the spark of this latest series of conflicts between Israel and Iran stems from the Hamas attack on the state of Israel that took multiple Israeli hostages and the Iranian support of Hamas and Hezbollah as proxy forces of Iran that led to those attacks. So, what started off as an Israel Hamas war has basically escalated to include Iran as attacks upon the supporters of Hamas and Hezbollah, included generals and included Iranian officials, that then escalated with Iranian retaliation, which then brought an Israeli attack on nuclear facilities in Iran, which also prompted the United States to move away from negotiations to a new Iranian nuclear deal to strike at the Iranian nuclear sites. But there are multiple causes and roots to why this is.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the negotiation because there was or there is still a negotiation going on between the U.S. and Iran. After 60 days, the president said 61, there was an attack by Israel to Iran.
I told them to do the deal. They should have done the deal. Their cities have been blown to pieces. They've lost a lot of people. They should have done the deal. I told them do the deal. So I don't know. I'm not too much in the mood to negotiate now.
Right. So to understand the history of the Iranian nuclear deal, we have to go back to the Obama administration. And during the Obama administration, at that time, Secretary of State John Kerry basically negotiated with the Iranians a nuclear deal, which we called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. What that plan of action did was, one, the Iranians agreed that they were going to limit enrichment to 3.67% or 4%. And highly enriched uranium, you only need 3 to 4% to be able to power nuclear facilities for peaceful purposes, for energy, right? In the case of Miami, we have Turkey Point. When we enrich uranium to basically power Miami-Dade County, we only need 3% or 4% highly enriched uranium. Anything beyond that threshold is the weaponization of highly enriched uranium. So in order to build a fission bomb, a nuclear bomb, like what we saw in the Second World War, you need 70 to really 90% highly enriched uranium. So once you go beyond 5%, once you're into 10 or 15%, then the intent is obvious and clear that the intent is to build a nuclear weapon. And so the Iranians, number one, agreed not to enrich uranium at more than 4%. Two, they agreed to get rid of 2/3 of their stockpile of highly enriched uranium. Three, they agreed that the Arak reactor, that is a heavy water reactor, and the difference between light water and heavy water reactors is with heavy water reactors, you could create plutonium, which allows you to build fusion bombs, which we know as hydrogen bombs, which tend to be 10 to 100 times more powerful than the fission bombs. So they agree to basically change the design at the Arak reactor to allow for that reactor not to be able to create weapons-grade plutonium. And then finally, they're going to allow the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, to basically investigate, to inspect, and to make sure that Iran is complying. And if they are, then we're going to basically release frozen assets that belong to Iran but has been frozen in Western banks. This deal was in many ways a benchmark, and it was successful and in place from 2016 to 2018, and the IAEA confirmed that Iran had complied with every portion of the deal. Now, why did the United States, in particular the first Trump administration, decided to pull out of the deal. One, they were upset that the deal did not have enough verification. And this critique actually came from the National Security Advisor at that time, which was Lieutenant General McMaster, who today is a fellow at the Stanford Herbert Hoover Institute. And what Lieutenant McMaster would say, Lieutenant General McMaster would say is that we needed a new deal that tended to be more transparent. It needed to be immediate, and it needed to be permanent. So what does that mean? Well, within the original deal, they basically, Iran agreed not to enrich uranium for 15 years. What the United States wants under the Trump administration is for it not to have any sunset clauses, for it to be permanent, is the first portion of what the new deal or what the Trump administration would like that deal to be. Number two, the sites that were open for inspection under the original deal, under the first agreement, was the known nuclear sites. And there were about 17 sites that were known. 3 of the sites were sites that most likely where highly enriched uranium was taking place, where the enrichment of uranium was taking place, which were the 3 sites that were bombed by the United States in recent days. So it did not include military facilities that could have enriched uranium hiding at different sites. So what the Trump administration wanted was immediate inspections without a 24-day period for Iran to comply. They wanted immediate inspections of all sites, not just the nuclear facilities, but military installations, something that the Iranian regime did not want to agree with. They also wanted AI-based immediate real-time monitoring in case there was a failure in compliance. And then they wanted the release of frozen assets or the release of sanctions to be tied to the compliance of all facilities. So they wanted it to be permanent. They wanted real-time inspections without a 24-day period. They wanted all sites, and they wanted to make sure that compliance and asset relief or sanction relief was tied together.
This is a great explanation, Professor Tapia, especially for the students and any other civilian trying to understand the conflict between Israel and Iran. President Obama claimed victory, I remember, during that time when they signed the contract with Iran. But now President Trump realized that he wants a little bit more, that Iran, trying to have nuclear weapons, and he said it clearly that that cannot happen on his watch. And will that be the reason why the U.S. bombing at least 3 sites, nuclear sites in Iran?
Well, that's what the current administration is claiming. Now, there's a question on whether or not Iran truly had the capability of developing a nuclear weapon within the next 15 years. The original agreement would basically proclaim that Iran was stopped from being able to develop a nuclear weapon, and it pushed back the breakout capacity of a nuclear weapon for 15 years. Something that the Trump administration disputes, but many intelligence officials basically confirmed the original assessment of the Obama administration, that truly Iran had kind of given up on a nuclear program after 2005, after the US invasion of Iraq. And then the Obama administration 10 years later guaranteed that the program would be dismantled by coming to this joint agreement. The sanctions that went into place in the beginning of the Obama administration, not just by the United States, but by the European Union, by the Russian Federation, it was an all hands on deck type of situation that asserted so much pressure on Iran that it brought them to the table to the original agreement. And a lot of the estimates at that time basically showed that Iran did not have the capacity at that time to build a nuclear weapon. Now, the fear was that if they continued to highly enrich uranium, if they continued to enrich uranium to the point where they could build multiple nuclear bombs, that the assembly of those weapons would happen quite rapidly and quickly. And part of the reason why many people, not just in the Trump administration, but a lot of scholars like McMaster's and others believed that there needed to be a tougher verification regime within that original agreement that had taken place. The problem is that if you decide to go down the nuclear option, it really limits your ability to get the regime to comply, because there's no guarantee that you've eliminated all of the highly enriched uranium. There's no guarantee just because you hit the sites that all of the highly enriched uranium were at those sites or other military installations. And you may have basically radicalized the regime, you've marginalized the moderates within the Iranian regime, and it could push the breakout capacity to go nuclear at a much more rapid pace. And that's the fear that we're beginning to see coming out of the intelligence community, especially with a report that was leaked by the Defense Intelligence Agency that the administration is really upset about, and they don't like the way that the media has basically characterized the leak as saying that probably the strikes did not eliminate highly enriched uranium, and that the Iranians probably have that uranium at other sites, which means that a breakout capacity could take place much more rapidly in the upcoming months or even years compared to the agreement that was put there in place before.
I'm assuming you're referring to the latest report that maybe media have been talking about, that probably the three main sites, nuclear sites in Iran, have not been destroyed completely, and we are just watching Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth going so hard at it, trying to explain to viewers that this is not true, that the U.S. has done an amazing job destroying those sites.
The highly successful strikes in Iran. Let me read the bottom line here. President Trump directed the most complex and secretive military operation in history, and it was a resounding success, resulting in a ceasefire agreement and the end of the 12-day war. There's been a lot of discussion about what happened and what didn't happen. Step back for a second. Because of decisive military action, President Trump created the conditions to end the war, decimating, choose your word, obliterating, destroying Iran's nuclear capabilities.
So now the question that I wanted to ask you is, after that attack by the U.S., do you feel confident that Iran will not have the capability to build a nuclear weapon?
No, I do not. In fact, the biggest fear of going forward with this type of attack was that once the attack is made, it tends to radicalize the regime even further. And it tends to marginalize moderate voices within the regime that up to now has actually put a lot of pressure on the Ayatollahs, on the Supreme Leader, and on others not to continue with the nuclear program. These voices have now been marginalized, and who now basically have in many ways, the bully pulpit within Iran kind of radicalizing the regime even further, are those military officials that have always said that Iran needed a nuclear weapon. And so the fear now is that the Iranian regime is racing towards the development of a nuclear weapon, that if the facilities were not completely destroyed, or if the highly enriched uranium has not been eliminated within these sites and they're located in other sites, that nuclear testing may take place within the upcoming months or a year, which will then prompt further U.S. action and a further escalation of the conflict in order to prevent that to take place. The best alternative to that scenario would be to de-escalate. It would be to diffuse the situation, to not just do a ceasefire, but create a new comprehensive agreement that guarantees that the nuclear material is accounted for and destroyed and diffuses the situation. In order for that to work, it's not just enough to work with the Iranians, but we have to diffuse all sides of the conflict, which means putting pressure on our friends and allies, that includes Israel, not to escalate and not to continue to attack Iran. And that's the challenge that you see the Trump administration is struggling with. And you heard it from the president himself, from President Trump, when he was frustrated and he spoke to the media, and he even used an expletive, angry, about Israel and Iran not abiding by the ceasefire that was negotiated by the United States.
You mentioned the latest statement made by the president at the White House. Let's take a listen real quick.
But we basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Do you understand that?
Do you want to respond to Iran?
That was President Donald Trump super mad at Israel and Iran still sharing rockets after a ceasefire agreement was in place. You mentioned, Professor Tapia, the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Who is he? He was a president before, now he's the supreme leader. Tell us more about the power of a supreme leader in Iran.
Well, the power does stem from the council, right? The supreme leader is the one that makes the final decision. You have a president and you have a prime minister that basically does many of the day-to-day administrative actions of what takes place. But at the end of the day, the person who makes the final decision, where power is vested, is going to be in the Supreme Council and in the Supreme Leader. That's the person who's going to be making the decisions after all of the negotiations are done. And so Khomeini came into power after Khomeini basically passes away. And at that time, he is asked to take the leadership mantle, and it was supposed to be temporary, but here we are decades later, and he is still in power. So Khomeini is the one that really makes a lot of the decisions. And he basically plays the balancing act between a very radical regime, a very radical military faction, and a more moderate faction. And so he has always been kind of the compromise between these two sides. The fear is that if the regime is destabilized and Khomeini is thrown from power, if a more radical regime will come into power. And that was the fear that the United States had when we heard reports that there was possible assassination attempts of Khomeini. And the fear is what comes next, what comes thereafter. When the United States pushed a coup backed by the CIA that pushed Mossadegh from power and brought into power the Shah, this brought repercussions within the region. By 1979, we had the Iranian Revolution, in which a radical regime had basically taken over and pushed out U.S. interests from the country. This then led to a decades-long conflict between the United States, Iraq, Iran, in that region of the world. And for people to better understand, it led to the Iranian hostage crisis of 1979. Later in 1980, the United States backed Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi invasion of Iran. The United States did limited strikes on Iran during the Iraqi-Iranian war that took place over close to a decade, in which 2 million people perished. And so you had a very radical regime. You began to see some moderation taking place over the 1990s, as you basically had protests breaking out in different parts of Iran. After 9/11, the Iranians actually came to our assistance. The Iranians did not like the Taliban being in power in Afghanistan, and they provided useful assistance in providing U.S. forces the ability to carry out operations in that region to basically oust the Taliban from power and go after al-Qaeda. When we were planning on the ousting of the Iraqi regime, the Iranian regime, the Ayatollahs and others basically said that they would like to assist us in overthrowing Saddam Hussein from power. At that time, Vice President Dick Cheney basically scoffed at the assistance and began to posture that Iran could have been the next target after the Iraq invasion. That worried Iran, and that prompted the Iranian regime to begin to fund their nuclear program. And so by 2004, 2005, there tended to be an escalation, and you had radicals within the regime like Ahmadinejad that really wanted to push forward this nuclear program because they felt it was the best way to defend the sovereignty of Iran. However, by the time of the Obama administration, you began to see a new cooperative relationship begin to take place as the international community leveraged sanctions against Iran, and it began to cripple the Iranian regime. Moderates started demanding negotiations with the United States, and you have the beginnings of a moderate revolutionary movement within Iran that prompted the regime to come towards the United States and work with the United States to negotiate their differences. Unfortunately, with these latest series of attacks, many of these moderate voices have been marginalized.
Our guest today is Professor Richard Tapia, political science professor at Miami-Dade College. We wish that we had more time to talk about the war between Russia and Ukraine. Hopefully we have you back on our next show to talk about that. But one thing I wanted to mention before we go, Professor Tapia, is a regime change is possible in Ukraine, in Iran. President Donald Trump said it clearly that he doesn't want a regime change. On the contrary, the Israeli prime minister wants a regime change in Iran.
I think the real fear that the United States has is that the regime change that will take place will not be the regime change we want. And the regime change we want is a more moderate Iran. That today, after the strikes, becomes far more unlikely. And it's part of the reason why President Trump did not want Khamenei assassinated by a foreign power. And it's also the reason why he basically says he doesn't want a complete regime change, because the disorder that would come from that regime change will create political instability in the region. The also big fear is if you do have the collapse of the Iranian regime and they do have highly enriched uranium, you may get a radical terrorist regime that has access to highly enriched uranium that could build a nuclear bomb or even a dirty bomb that could find its way not only to the United States, but to some of our allied states, whether in the Middle East or in Europe. And that creates a disaster in which the United States is going to once again have to confront since the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union collapsed and many nuclear weapons went missing, and the United States and the CIA had to basically find them and help the successor state, the Russian Federation, and work with the Ukrainians to give up their nuclear weapons and so forth to secure all of this nuclear material. If there is a regime collapse and all of that highly enriched uranium had not been eliminated, it creates a nightmare scenario in which the United States then has to find a way to basically secure all of this nuclear material. So it's for those reasons that the Trump administration is on point in saying they do not want regime change. The regime change that the United States would like to see in the future is one that gradually takes place as the moderates come into power, and eventually more power is given to the democratically elected president and prime minister of Iran, and rather than less of the Supreme Council and the Ayatollahs. But what you're beginning to hear from some of our friends in the case of Israel is they want regime change, assuming that the regime that's going to come thereafter is going to be better than the regime we have here. We know from past experience that tends not to be the case when regime change is implemented from externally, as we saw in the past decades.
Should we also mention that the impact, economic impact that the regime change will have on the U.S., especially in South Florida, where you are right now, or in Washington, D.C.? Tell us more about the economic impact that you think that could have on the U.S.
Well, if the Iranian regime collapses, one has to just look back at history. When the Iranian hostage crisis took place, the price of energy rose by 200 to 300%. So think about the price of oil, the price of gas going up exponentially, causing inflation to basically increase to the point where you have stagflation and a recession. We saw that in the late 70s when we had the energy crisis. And the energy crisis in the late 70s was due to the Iranian hostage crisis, but also the Arab oil embargo after the US support of the Israel-Egyptian War of 1973. So the collapse of the Iranian regime, and also maybe the closing of the Strait of Hormuz, could basically cause energy prices to spike and the price of consumer goods all over the world to basically spike as well. So that's also another major concern for one to have. The United States would be in charge of maintaining the freedom of the seas and making sure that you have all cargo ships and oil being able to transport itself through the Strait of Hormuz, through the Persian Gulf, and throughout the world. But it's not going to just be the United States that's going to be concerned. China, that gets a lot of their energy from the Middle East, is going to be highly concerned. Russia is going to be highly concerned as well. And then also there's the concern I mentioned before, all of this nuclear material that's unaccounted for that then has to be secured may bring about a military intervention where you may have to occupy the country. That's a $2 to $3 trillion nation building adventure that the United States right now, nor the Trump administration or Obama administration or Biden administration ever want to engage in. That is a monumental effort to basically have to bring stability in that part of the world. And you're talking about a country, Iran, that's almost double the size of that of Iraq. And so regime change is something that an American president really doesn't want to deal with.
That's right. Our guest today is Professor Richard Tapia from Miami-Dade College, Political Science at Miami-Dade College, to better understand the conflict between Israel and Iran. Hopefully we have him next time to talk also about the war between Russia and Ukraine. Thank you so much, Professor Tapia, for being here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me on the program. Always a pleasure.
All right, and stay tuned to watch all the other episodes of James Reports, whether on jamesreports.com or also on all our social media, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, you name it. We are there to bring you the information in English, Creole, your langage, langue pour la même.